Hello, this is Patrick Moffett, Senior Solution Engineer for VMware. Today we're going to be going over a little bit of usage of the authentication backend configuration for SaltStack Config. In particular today, we do single sign-on, so we could do SAML or OIDC identity providers. In this case, we're looking very specifically at Active Directory, so I'm going to be implementing an LDAP authentication backend. Ultimately, whatever flavor of authentication you're concerned in, this is applicable to some extent. Obviously, the field selections and things like that are going to be different for either of the other SSO type providers, but today we'll be looking specifically at LDAP schema, and actually I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have some pre-fills, in this case specific to Active Directory, and that won't do all of the work for me, but it'll do a goodly portion of it. So it's worth noting that the way that this is kind of broken down, some of the initial stuff, the name for this authentication backend, this will be what is displayed when users are selecting which backend to authenticate against. So it's, in this case, I made a SaltStack domain. I'll just name the authenticator SaltStack as well. The host name that I need to provide obviously is going to be dependent on your environment, and I forgot to take note of this one first, so I'm going to just kind of jump over here. And I'm going to copy this. This is in an Amazon VPC, so I'll just grab that guy right there. I'll provide this direct by IP. And then 389, as far as Active Directory is concerned, is the typical non-SSL port. I'm not sure why it then also wants to enable SSL. In this case, in my demo environments, I don't create certificates, so I'm not going to actually enable SSL or do certificate validation. Obviously, in practice, particularly in prod, you want valid certificates, and you want to be running SSL pretty much all the time. The background sync field here concerns how often SaltStack Config reaches out to the directory service to coordinate things like deletion of user accounts and things like that. Obviously, if you deactivate or you lock a user in Active Directory, the authentication itself will fail, but this also allows SaltStack Config to automatically purge database entries and things like that for any of the role assignment if a user is removed from a group or something like that. The next segment of this that we're going to look at is handling the actual authentication bind. So we need to provide an admin account who is able to do bind to the directory server to confirm or validate that we are providing valid credentials for a user that wants to log in. So in this case, I've provided a domain service account, put them in its own, or I put it in its own OU. I've named it Salt Admin. Its username is just Salt. That won't actually figure into here because we're giving the entire distinguished name of this account pretty much right up front. We also need to provide a base. In this case, I'll just give it, I could narrow this down to the OU, but here I'll just give it the entire domain. It just wants to double check that things are in the place where they need to be before handling that. Here I know my arbitrary domain or my service account username or my service account password, so I'll provide that. In terms of what we're looking at in the filter, here we're doing Boolean and to make sure that the object class of anybody that we are trying to authenticate is a person. So we're not going to try to authenticate machine accounts or something like that. We're also not going to accidentally try to, maybe we have something like some incidents of usernames and group names that are the same. We want to be very clear that we're trying to authenticate a person rather than accidentally grabbing a group or something like that. And then SAM account name is our unique user ID for individual users. And so we're identifying that here with the curly brackets or the braces around the username specifier here. So that's just Salt's understanding or SaltStack Config's understanding specifically of what we're defining as the username in this case. We'll proceed down to groups. So in this case, I'm sorry, I should comment also that the object UID right here is something that we use in case there are collisions. I don't think I did this in this is the LDP .exe tool in Active Directory or in Windows that I'm able to just produce little LDAP searches. I don't know if I have anything here with the, okay. So here I have the object GUID here. So we will use this in case there are specific collisions or something like that, or we have common usernames between multiple directory backends or something like that. So it's something that isn't necessarily used, but it will settle things if we have collisions. I think next we're looking at group configuration. So I have I created a separate OU for my groups, and in this case, E. Moffat is a member of Solution Engineers. I really just need the search subtree here, so I'm going to look at specifically this OU. Ultimately, if you have the ability to narrow down your result set to specifically the people that you assume will ever be logging into SaltStack Config, the more you can do to narrow it down, the better. You have options other than subtree, although if you want more than a handful of results, you're probably going to be looking at subtree. Other than, if we need to deviate from this, it's likely that there is some schema at work that is more complex and well known than we're used to dealing with. But that's how that is. That's why that comes in as a default. In terms of the DN filter, we're just ensuring that we're looking at the group object class rather than users or machines or any of those other things. And then the actual name attribute in this case is the CN of the group itself. So essentially the display name that we're going to use for the group that we're looking at. Finally, an optional thing here in terms of whether or not we're specifying an attribute that identifies if a user is a member of a specific group. That kind of ties back into some of that background sync and just ensuring that everything matches up, that a specific user is indicated as being a member of a group if we're trying to use things, if we're trying to use particularly nested groups or things like that, to ensure that people belong to the right places. Now I'm also going to provide the base DN for any of my user searches. So in this case, I'm going to grab this. In this case, I have a separate OU specifically for users. Again, you want to limit that result set as much as possible. So in this case, even just supplying an OU, other than doing things at the entire domain level, means that we'll be leaving out a lot of the built-ins. So the administrator account and a bunch of these other things, the other guest or everybody accounts, things like that, will be left out of that subtree search because we're narrowing it down to a specific OU or a specific, CN-based container if we're doing things that way in our schema. Finally, again, we're using the SAM account name attribute to be able to identify specific users. So this is what we're associating as the user ID in terms of how we refer to, what our identity is when we're logged in. Clicking on Update Preview should come up with results if we were to do things right. It won't necessarily communicate feedback to you very specifically. It does give me the option to kind of roll things down so I can see the DNs of in this case, I see that there are 2 solutions engineers here. We can look at their identity. Again, we support nested groups and things like that. So we can kind of roll these things down to make sure that those things meet our specifications before we handle a save. When you do that save operation, obviously the other case other than save being successful is that there's some error. So if we have something like a wrong password, or the admin bind DN is wrong or something like that, or there's a misphrased filter, then you'll see a red banner appear there, and it'll give you the relevant feedback towards what the actual error is. Once I've done that, it's worth noting that the preview window is really just for me to double check my settings. If I want to be able to handle the import of individual users and groups, then I need to do that up here at the top of that specific authentication configuration page. The other thing to note is that it's important that if I have a specific desire to isolate individual users, it's good for me to include those users as individuals first, and then import their groups. Otherwise, they'll be implicitly included, and it can become difficult in some cases to ensure that I have the ability then to narrow things down to specific individuals. Once I know that I have imported any of the users or groups or individuals that I want to be able to assert role-based access control for, I can jump down to roles. So the administrator, super user, and user roles are the 3 defaults. We can certainly create our own. So in this case, I'm going to make ones that match the LDAP groups or the Active Directory groups that I brought in. So in this case, I'll supply one for solution engineers. I have to spell it right though. And then I have the ability to, let me just save this really quick. But we have very, very granular control over who can do what things. So it's worth noting that super user can always do all of the things. Initially, the super user role is assigned only to the root account. This is essentially to prevent us from locking ourselves out. Yes, you can include additional groups and users in as super users if for whatever reason there's a desire to kind of double check, maybe we don't share the root password or something like that. Totally acceptable if you want to give yourself another out there, although be aware of the awesome power that you're assigning to people. The administrator role kind of gives a template for the more typical use case where you can view most things, you can handle a certain number of things, but in this case, I think typically it will exclude things like usage of SecOps and things like that. So ostensibly, you want to grant people specifically the ability to run assessments or even do things like create new policies or run remediations. Ultimately, all of those things very granularly. Sorry, I made changes to it. I forgot. Ultimately we have the ability to very granularly choose who can do which things, either from the kind of basics of what that is or down to very specifically read, write, and run those types of things. It's worth noting that there is a user default that tends to include all available groups and users, but this user account has the ability to see various things, but ultimately has access to basically nothing. In fact, the only reason they have the access to this CentOS target is because I happened to include it before. So by default, in this case, all users have the ability to log in, but they really can't do anything. You can't create new jobs. You can't bring in pillar data. You can't supply those things. You can't run jobs that are there, and typically they can't see anything. So in this case, with my solutions engineers, I'm going to give them the ability to do a handful of things. We actually can clone this from another role if for whatever reason, if we want to use an administrator as a base template or something like that, we can clone that into a new group name so we don't have to jump through handling all of the selections, but I'll just do that here. I want kind of a wide array of things for my solutions engineers to be able to do to kind of demonstrate what's going on in the environment. So I can save this. I can also do things like handle specific role-based access. So I want my solutions engineers to be able to read and maybe even modify the identity of the Linux group. And I want them to be able to look at any of my Windows servers. And then there are maybe only a handful of jobs. I want them to be able to do something like run the enablement of the presence beacon, and I want them to be able to do something like do test.pings. In fact, we can actually maybe have them write certain parameters, if they want to supply arguments to test.ping, but I certainly don't want them to be able to delete it. So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of who can do what things across those parts of the environment. So I can give them that specific role-based access control to be able to do those things. So I'll save this here. And then again, we can import users individually, or we can import groups, and SaltStack Config understands the identity of nesting in groups. And so we know that if I give this to my solution engineers, then we can grant them the ability to do these things. Maybe I want my site reliability engineers ultimately to essentially be super users. I can't clone this role. I could manually go through and add everything, but it's worth noting that the super user role will always have all permissions for everything. Whereas if I take something like the administrator role and I clone this and I give this to the SREs, then in that case, they'll have all of these abilities. But if a super user then creates a new role or creates new resources or something like that, SREs won't have implicit access to all of those individual resources. I would have to specify those as they're added. So ultimately, again, you have a lot of control over who sees what particular slices of the environment. So I'm going to log out really quick as the root user, and then I will observe here that I have the ability to select between internal, which is just the local users. Right now, root is the only internal user I have. I haven't created any additional local users, but here I have the ability to log in ultimately as myself. and we can look at some of those restrictions and the way that role-based access control is applied. So this group has the ability to see, again, Linux minions. So I see all 4 of these. Because my CentOS minions are a subset of the Linux minions, I'm able to see these as well. And here I have the single Windows server in this environment. So it's also worth noting that I have some, or sorry, I can see the CentOS user because the CentOS group is visible to the user role as well, and so everybody is included in users by default. So if I hadn't specifically given Linux and Windows servers view abilities to the solution engineers group, then I would be restricted to only seeing the CentOS minions. Again, in terms of running jobs, either if I look through the actual jobs console, I see only those 2 jobs available to me. I can also do this and run any of these jobs. So I gave myself the ability to run test.ping. I can carry this out against all minions or any of the other target groups that I'm able to view. And then ultimately, in terms of being able to do something like, I think for enable presence, I gave myself the ability to run it, but I can't change the identity of this. I don't have sufficient permission to do something like modify the inline pillar to be able to change the way that this job behaves. I can't modify that before running it. But I do have the ability to write, so I could actually include things for specific arguments for the test.ping if I wanted to do that. So we have the ability to handle some of those changes. These users are restricted as much or as little as we so choose. But again, following the general least privilege goals of granting permissions, the idea is to give people the smallest subset of things that they need to be able to have access to. Once we've settled these things and we know what those things are going to look like in terms of how our directory system is populated and what users and what groups need to exist and things like that, typically the idea then is we can just rely on managing directory itself, know that these groups are associated with sets of individuals, and then the management of that happens primarily on the directory side and less in the backend poking at SaltStack Config itself. Hopefully this is helpful. It certainly is a good way to kind of look at how we have that ability to deliver process and deliver jobs to down level teams, or even I say in many of my demos that we can do this down to the level of user self-service in some of these cases. So you really could restrict somebody to be able to view just the one machine they care about and run just the 1 or 2 jobs that they should be able to on that one machine. And so ultimately we have the ability to provide those sane guardrails around process to make sure that the right people are doing the right thing to the right machines when they're supposed to do them. Thank you. See you later.